Thank you very much. Thanks, INASP, for including Adel on the programme. I usually have a just-in-time philosophy when it comes to preparing presentations for meetings like these. It usually works really, really well. This time I had a little bit less time than expected, though, so I'm not sure if I've done justification to the topic, but hopefully people will find it interesting nonetheless. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Agile itself, just in case people aren't familiar with who we are and the work we do. And then to talk about terminology around the difference between national and international journals. I was pleased that Teresa introduced our day by talking about practical suggestions and solutions for the ways forward, and hopefully I'm going to be able to contribute some of those at the end. African Journals Online is a non-profit organisation based in South Africa. We exist to try and make African published research more visible and accessible online, and also to improve the quality of the publications. We are based in South Africa, in a small university town currently called Grahamstown, the name of which is probably going to change quite soon, as is the name of the university, Rhodes University, in the town we're based. We're a really small team. We have 4 full-time staff members. We have some additional help from a part-time software developer, very part-time finance person. We work with quite a few, mostly postgrad student temps to help us with our content loading. We've got a board of directors. AJA was started in 1998 by INASP as the first of its Journal Online projects. And it was started as metadata of African published journals, so just tables of contents and abstracts. It was kind of relaunched once it had proven that there was a need for it. Moved on to open journal systems, open source software, and then an expression of interest was invited from African-based institutions to continue running the initiative. So in 2005, an independent non-profit organisation was set up in South Africa. That's who we are. We've been running it ever since. So what we are is basically an online library, a hosting service for African published, peer-reviewed, qualifying journals, all different disciplines, all different publishing models. Over half of the full text is open access. I don't have the exact number of articles on the platform on the top of my head, but it's about 130,000, I think. From the 518 titles that we're currently working with, 32 countries in Africa are represented. Certainly not covering the entire research output of the continent. There are lots more journals who are in the application process for inclusion to AJOL. One of the kind of deeper reasons we do the work we do is that we try to correct an overemphasis on northern research outputs needing to be provided to the poor southern countries, developing countries. Actually, there is research that is done in the south, and there's a definite need for a flow of information in the other direction, as well as kind of south-south access, researchers in developing countries being able to access the relevant content from their own countries and regions. Sorry for the text-busy slides. Tend to do that. Willie's presentation had beautiful graphics and so on. Sorry, the just-in-time philosophy doesn't allow for that. So I'm not going to spend much time on what AJOL does. One of the things that we do is we engage with many different organizations on behalf of the interests of African journals around the world. research, lots of them are represented in this room, obviously INASP, Research for Life, Crossref, the Elsevier Foundation, so on and so forth. So even just as a tiny organisation, small as we are, we do reach out to all of these. A new one is, an interesting one is the Wikipedia library. And we're trying, the previous talk about NRENs, to interact better with the Ubuntu Net Alliance in South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, that NREN. So to move on to the actual core of my talk, the importance of national publications. Well, it's quite important to unpack the terminology that we use, because the actual words that we use we kind of assume that we all mean the same thing by them, and that the definitions are correct, but kind of question that. There can be useful distinctions in that the publications, journal publications in developing countries, certainly in Africa, are different in some quite crucial ways from those of the North. For example, they're usually published by kind of an institution, a national scholarly society, for example, rather than by a big professional publisher with loads of polish and additional skills available. But the terminologies, national versus international, when it comes to journals, can also be quite harmful. So the assumption that a local or a national journal means a low-quality journal that is published in a developing country. The assumption that an international or mainstream journal means a high-quality journal published in North America or Europe. I think a lot of this terminology, another kind of terminology issue that is often used is core versus periphery, with the periphery being developing country research and research publications. The term actually, this terminological distinction actually came about from an ISI meeting in 1982, where the role of third world publications was discussed in terms of its inclusion, or their inclusion into the impact factor. And the terminology problem has existed ever since. Clearly, though, there's a continuum between the importance and the use of any journals and research interests within those journals also. An example of that is Ebola, which became pretty interesting to the rest of the world over the last few years, and no longer just a problem specific to one or two countries in West Africa. But it also kind of underscores an important point, which is that once it became so interesting to the rest of the world, some important Ebola research by African researchers was then published in northern journals. And this is actually just an extreme and rather dramatic example of what happens all the time. There is a kind of international intellectual property brain drain from developing countries, in that the research outputs are sent for publication in the north, strengthening the northern systems of knowledge sharing, and actually weakening the southern ones. It's a bit of a kind of African or developing country reversal of aid. This is sort of enforced by the current journal quality measures, by assumptions and by institutional systems within African universities and developing country universities. And Africa is suffering most from the global knowledge divide. This article by Jean-Claude Guédon, one of the original signatories of the Open Access Berlin Declaration, it's a 25-page article, but it discusses the systemic global inequities in scientific power and in publishing. It's a brilliant article, highly recommend it. From a different quote from a couple of weeks ago from a Scopus presentation, 92% of African authors that are captured in the Scopus data publish in northern journals. Quite a shocking and scary stat. Of course, the Scopus and Thomson Reuters statistics that are always used in these sorts of presentations are not actually capturing the entirety of the journals publishing in developing countries nor the authors. This is a great pity because many of the so-called national or local journals that are publishing in Africa and other developing countries are accomplishing astonishingly robust work that's of critical and even life-saving importance under really quite challenging circumstances. This is one of those diagrams that uses the Thomson Reuters stats. You probably can't see it very well, I'm afraid, but it kind of translates the production of research outputs into almost a kind of a world map in squares. Here's Latin America. That's the United States. That's the United Kingdom. And that there is Africa. Nigeria and South Africa are the only two that are actually listed. I think it's from 2012. That, of course, is not really a good representation of what is actually happening, as evidenced by initiatives such as AGIL. Last year, in 2015, from Google Analytics, we had almost 1 million regular users of the website, repeat users, not just once-off people engaging or coming across an article. More than half of those were from the African continent. So almost 55% from Africa, nearly 500,000 Africans accessing African research. So there is a clear demand for national journals within the South. And also a continuing demand from the North as well. When we first started using Google Analytics on our site, back in, I think, 2006 or so, these pie slices looked very different. Africa was a teeny tiny little slice of the pie. But the actual numbers from Europe and North America, and certainly from Asia, have grown. Just percentage-wise, Africa has increased. So some more key thoughts about the importance of national publications. As has come up already a couple of times today, the importance of evidence-informed policy making. So for that to properly inform and meet development needs in Africa, particularly and in developing countries, and the SDGs, that needs to come from relevant, robust, contextually aware and sensitive research. The decisions about what research articles to include for publication in northern journals aren't necessarily going to reflect the development needs of developing countries. So who best can do this research? Who best can come up with the research questions that are relevant and useful? Who can best select the relevant articles of interest for publication? And how can the results best be shared to those who need them in developing countries? Another aspect about journals in developing countries, they contribute to the kind of ecosystem of knowledge sharing and academic skills. It's kind of an under-acknowledged strength of knowledge sharing on the continent, although there is a little bit of a disconnect between the journals and the institutions that they're associated with. That's why I say under-acknowledged. The current push factors that encourage researchers from the South to publish in journals in the North actually encourage researchers in the South to look at research interests of developed countries as opposed to ones that are relevant and important in their own contexts, just so that they can get published in a journal that is going to add to their career track. There are also new issues in Africa around the expansion of commercial publishers into Africa as a potential market. So obviously in this context, it's quite important to explore that. One quote regarding that is, "We fear being swallowed by elitism." So while acknowledging that there is competition between journals for content wherever they are in the world, what can be done to improve the North-South publishing power inequity and to help strengthen the journals and the journal publishing systems in developing countries? What are the roles and responsibilities of Northern publishers? Obviously, there is a lot of goodwill on the part of the Northern commercial publishers. This gathering is evidence of that. Research for Life, contributions to the Wikipedia library, and so on. That's wonderful. But is there more that can be done, and is there more that should be done? I know the Elsevier Foundation, for example, does an enormous amount of really good work, but I was quite surprised at what their budget is in comparison to Elsevier, the company. I think that there is more corporate social responsibility contributions and funding and activities that can be done and should be done. When exploring developing countries as new markets, participatory and sensitive engagement and research to understand the existing systems of knowledge sharing within those countries, to support and complement these rather than kind of displace or radically disrupt them. What are the roles and responsibilities of African journals? Another quote, "We fear the recolonization of African research publishing." So there is definitely a need for African journals to sort of step up and come up with sort of responses on how to collaborate and how to handle this as well. How can we persuade African universities to shift their researcher incentive structures to support their own systems of research sharing instead of those of the developed North? And here come the practical suggestions, a few of them. The current accepted quality measures are historically and still biased against journals from the South. The impact factor unit of Thomson Reuters, by the way, is for sale. I'm sure many of you know that. That's quite an interesting and potentially game-changing factor just by itself. But nonetheless, in response to that, a different system of proving the robustness of quality of publishing of journals from developing countries is under development by INASP and AGIL. And hopefully that can step in as an alternative solution for universities to be able to use in their promotional strategies for their faculty. So the comment before about Northern commercial publishers respecting and learning about existing knowledge sharing systems in developing countries, possibly some guidelines, the INASP guidelines about that. Maybe some ideas could be added in, some points could be added into that document around that, some discussion held on that score. And then a way possibly for journal editors of Northern journals to network more actively with Southern journals. For example, if you receive a submission from a Southern author that you don't think is of relevance or interest to your readership, but nonetheless is sound research, well done, a good contribution to the field, possibly that can be referred onto a journal publishing in the South. So Very quick. Thanks for your attention.